Good morning, Westside. I'm Pastor Patrick, as Pastor Kayla said. I'm the youth pastor here on staff, if you don't know me. Pastor Dave is still enjoying his Hawaii vacation. They went shark diving, and I wanted to give a report. No one was eaten by a shark, so he will be back next week to continue the Genesis series for us. But this morning, we're going to continue to walk in that Genesis series. We're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 37. We're kind of going backwards. Last week, we talked about the story of Judah and Tamar, and I got to tell you, I said some words up here I never thought I'd say when I was preaching. So I'm just glad that we don't have those spicy terms into today's passage. But today, we're basically starting a 4-week mini-series on the story of Joseph. So we're just going to touch the surface of it, and we'll continue it throughout the rest of the month. I want you to know that I have a brother, and my brother's name is Weston. And Weston is one of my best friends. He's awesome. He's 29 years old. He lives with my parents. He has Down syndrome. And everything I'm about to tell you, my mom's here. She can vouch that I'm not lying. I'm not making this up. But one of the things that was always a hot topic at our dinner table was, who is Dad's favorite? Who's Dad's favorite? And we all would say that we were Dad's favorite. I would say I was Dad's favorite because when I was in college or high school, my dad drove more miles in his car to watch me play golf tournaments than you could ever imagine, right? And I'd say that time would signify that I was the favorite of Dad. But Weston would answer the question very differently. It wasn't just when we'd have the conversation at the dinner table, but then people around would also start to pick up on this question as well. And they'd say, Weston, who's your dad's favorite? And he would find me wherever I was in the room, and he'd look me dead in the eyes, he'd put a grin on his face, and he'd say, Kristen and I. And he knew that when he said that it would just send a dagger through my heart. He knew that I thought that I was my dad's favorite, so he said it to almost as like a little jab at me that not only does he think that he's the favorite, but even Kristen is above me in my dad's pecking order of who's the favorite. Genuinely, we found this to be hilarious. His delivery of the joke was just so perfect. He had great comedic timing with it. But you might ask, is he right? I would argue he's not. I think he's wrong. But you know what? Either way, we got a kick out of the joke. And, I think it's true for all of us. Everyone wants to be the favorite, right? We all want to be the favorite wherever it is that we are in our lives. And as much as we want to be the favorite, nobody wants to, not be the favorite or see someone else get special treatment because they are the favorite. At work, you can probably think of the employee who's your boss's favorite. The boss is, a little bit more lenient with them on everything that they do. They get away with like little mistakes here and there, and they always seem to get a little bit more vacation time than they're supposed to, right? They get 3 weeks, and somehow they're always taking 4 or 5 going to Mexico. What is up with that? How does that work? And I think the truth is we're not mad at the employee for getting the extra, special treatment, but we're really mad that we're not getting that same treatment as well. What about in your family? Is there a favorite sibling or child or grandchild? I'll say in my family, we know that Savannah is the favorite grandchild. She is spoiled to death. The truth of the matter is she's the only grandchild on either side of the family, but she doesn't need to know that. She thinks that she is the favorite, and she is. But living up to the standards set by another family member oftentimes leaves us feeling like we could be on the outside of our family. Maybe that's you today. Or what about your favorite sports teams? We got Colts fans in here, Pacers fans. I'm a Patriots fan, Celtics, NBA champions. Yes, I'm going to brag about that. But when you have a favorite sports team, you might have a favorite player who's out on the field, or a player who you think is going to be something special, has a lot of potential. And when that player finally gets in the game, even when they make a mistake, they drop the pass or they miss the shot, you always have an excuse like, yeah, but like if they just got a little bit more opportunity, they'd be fine. They would play better. And then you have the other guy who's on the team that you're like, hey, he should really not be playing as much as he is. But he gets a lot of playing time, extra opportunity, and every time that he drops a ball or misses a shot, it's his fault, right? We play our favorites back and forth in those moments. The truth is, favoritism is a reality that we all have to live with. It's something that's just in our worlds that happens. We don't like it when other people get opportunities, promotions, or praises that we don't believe that they deserve. Yet, when we're the favorites, we like to ride that wave for all it's worth, don't we? We just ride it until it runs out. We think everything should be fair and equal until it doesn't benefit us anymore. In the story of Joseph this morning, we're going to see the story of a son who is clearly the favorite of his father's, and what happens when the resentment of our hearts goes unaddressed. So this morning, if you got your Bibles, do me a favor, open it up to Genesis 37. That's where we're going to be all morning long. And I think the book of Genesis oftentimes can be described that it's kind of broken up into two parts. Okay, you have chapters 1 through 11, which basically describe the story of God and all of creation, the world. And through chapters 1 through 11, we see creation all the way up to the Tower of Babel. But then in chapter 12, we see the hinge point of the book, where God has now scattered people all across the earth because they chose to make their name great rather than serving the Lord. And it's at this point that God makes a covenant with Abraham, that he will make him into a great nation. Why does he do this with Abraham? He says this in Genesis 12:3. He says, so that all families of the earth will find blessing in you. Then from chapters 12 through 50, through the end of the book, we see the story of Abraham's family following this promise. And all along the way, Abraham and his descendants, they try so hard to mess up God's covenant. They try to disobey and disorganize and mess everything up. Yet God is faithful to his promise and blesses them, fulfilling his covenant. So the story of Joseph, this story isn't just a standalone, like just off to the side, one story within the Bible, but instead it's the continuation of the promise that God gave to Abraham back in chapter 12, that he would make them into a great nation, the nation of Israel. So Joseph, Jacob, his angry brothers, Potiphar's wife, and more all try throughout this story to mess up God's plan and force him to go back on his covenant. Yet in the midst of all of the problems that we'll see and all of the dysfunction, God is faithful. So we're blessed today as we look at this story. We know how it ends. We know what happens. We've seen the play multiple times. But today I challenge you to listen with fresh ears and feel what Joseph feels all along the way. Because even in the midst of chaos, our God is working. So with that being said, let's jump into Genesis 1 through 4, and this is what's written. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the son of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word of him. So Jacob, the father, he has 12 sons, with Joseph being the youngest of them all. The sons came from a variety of mamas, Leah, Rachel, and 2 servants. And these sons were born into this dysfunctional family life, and there's a trickle-down effect that we see into the brothers, into the sons of Jacob. Joseph, he was the youngest of all the sons, and because he was born when Jacob was in his old age, and also born from Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, he is the favorite, and everybody knows it. The same way we don't like favoritism in our lives, neither did Joseph's brothers. Jacob didn't do anything to help the situation either along the way. He actually gifts Joseph this very special gift. And as the play coins it, he gives him a Technicolor dream coat. Today, you and I, we're all wearing different colors. We're all wearing bright colored shirts, and it's summertime, and it's happy and light. But back in ancient Israel times, clothes, they didn't have these colors because that would be expensive. So only the most wealthy would wear these clothes. So this robe that is given to Joseph is special. It's unlike everything else that his brothers are wearing. So when Joseph receives this colorful robe, not only is it a gift from his father that none of the other brothers are receiving, but it also marked him as the favorite son. Every time his brothers saw him wearing that robe, it served as a reminder that not only Joseph was the favorite and the other sons would be below him in the eyes of their father. It was both marking Joseph as the favorite, but also signaling to those brothers that they were never going to live up to their brother Joseph. You see, when Weston would go and he would say that he was the favorite and Kristen was the favorite and I was not, it was in lighthearted fun, right? It was like, oh, okay, like no worries, ha ha ha, let's all laugh about this together. Within this family, I can imagine that there was no joking. There was no lightheartedness. The brothers, they hated Joseph for the special treatment that he received. Now I think about Jacob, the father. He's the father of all of these boys, isn't he? And he's not really helping the situation with what was already a contentious relationship. He's basically just pouring fuel on this fire that was already there. Does he not recognize the hatred that the boys had for Joseph? Does he really think that giving him a robe that will differentiate him from everybody else was a good idea? My assumption is that Jacob is probably blinded to his own special treatment of his son Joseph. In his heart, he knows that Joseph is special, but is probably unaware that his actions are not only uplifting Joseph, but pushing down the other 11 of his sons. I need you to know this, that what is unsaid speaks louder than what is said. What is unsaid speaks louder than what is said. Jacob probably never called a family meeting, gathered everyone in the living room and said, okay guys, I want you to know Joseph, he's my favorite, and you guys will never be as good as Joseph. That family meeting never happened. There was never a post, a tweet, or a picture showing the rankings of all of Jacob's sons with Joseph at the top. That wasn't there either. The same is true for us. The boss never comes out and says that this is my favorite employee, and yet we all know who the favorite employee is. It's easy to point fingers at Jacob and see the flaws of his ways, yet we do the same thing in our lives with our biases, our prejudices, and our preferences. We communicate what we value much more in what we do than what we say. We say that everyone is made in the image of God. Everyone has value in God's kingdom, but yet we overlook or ignore because there are people who make us uncomfortable, they don't look like us, or they just don't think like us. What we do is we draw invisible lines in the sand that put people on the outside without ever saying it out loud. Who has God called you to love, invite into community, and value that you've placed on the outside due to your actions? Or let's just say the unspoken truth out loud. Who have you placed on the outside due to what you've posted online before? Have you ever said or done something that would leave someone feeling unwelcome in the pew next to you? That they wouldn't feel welcomed here at your church? What you might have said, posted, or tweeted was about the presidential debate. It was about COVID. It was about same-sex marriage. It was about all of these hot-button topics. But what was said was that the people who were far from God would no longer be welcomed in. You didn't say it out loud, but yet when it was read, it communicated it loud and clear. Friends, let me challenge you this morning to think about what is being communicated to the world we live in with what is unsaid. Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:20, he writes this: "We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God." In this passage in 2 Corinthians 5 is actually labeled the ministry of reconciliation. We are called to be ambassadors for Christ, which means everything that we say, but also everything that we do is a reflection of the God that we serve. So we have to take our witness seriously. Jesus calls us to be the light of the world, the city on a hill. You see, Jacob, he wasn't intentional with his words, or he wasn't intentional with his actions. And because of it, what he communicated to his other 11 sons was that they were not valuable. Today, let's make an intentional choice to see our own blind spots and value what is being unsaid just as much as what is said. Let's continue on to verses 12 through 20. It says this: "Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Jacob said to Joseph, 'As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them.' 'Very well,' he replied. So he said to him, 'Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" Next slide. I was like, I'm sure I'm not done there. He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." So prior to this, we see Joseph, and he begins to share the dreams that he's having with his brothers, which essentially these dreams are saying that one day, me, Joseph, I will rule over all of you. Again, this doesn't help Joseph's case with his brothers. The hate and jealousy that's inside of his brothers' hearts continues to grow. And they begin to mock him. They begin calling him the dreamer, right? This boy, you are no longer Joseph to us, but you're just the dreamer. What begins as just sibling rivalry has turned into deep hurt and resentment. So Jacob tells Joseph to go out into the fields and just go check on your brothers, see how they're doing. So Joseph is sent off alone. He no longer has his father's eyes watching over him. Joseph, he gets to the field and he can't find them there. And there's a man that says, "Hey, they've actually moved. They're off in Dothan. So why don't you go out there and try and find them?" So Joseph, he continues to wander trying to find them. But before Joseph notices the brothers notice him. Joseph, he's alone and vulnerable. The brothers notice this opportunity, and the hatred that's in their hearts begins to take over. They decide that they're going to put Joseph in his place once and for all. Do you notice the escalation in this story? At first, the brothers, they hated him. Then they begin to mock him and call him the dreamer. And now they've decided that it's gone too far and they must kill him. The story doesn't begin with the brothers plotting to kill Joseph, but the hatred that's in their hearts, it continues to grow over time. Not only did the brothers hate Joseph, but they allowed that hatred to stew in their hearts, and it grew bigger and bigger until the moment came when the hatred took over. What we learn is that hatred is like a wildfire. It grows until it just takes over. The brothers of Joseph, they lost control of the hatred they had for him. They didn't just wake up one morning and decide, "Hey, you know what? We need to do something about Joseph. Let's murder him." But instead, they were out in the fields not thinking about it, but the opportunity came and the moment took over at that time. When we have hatred, jealousy, resentment, or hurt within our heart, and we choose not to deal with it, that hatred, jealousy, resentment, it continues to grow whether we like it or not. Then our buttons are pushed by somebody, adding a little bit of logs onto our fire, and it begins to grow. Then we're passed over or we're overlooked, causing us to stew more on the past, adding more fuel to the fire. And before you know it, the hatred and jealousy, it's not being triggered by the outside experiences that we're having. People aren't triggering it, but it's actually starting to just consume all of our thought life over and over, and it begins to devour and eat away at us. Then the moment or opportunity comes, and we do what we thought we would never say or do in that moment. We make the choice that we knew was not right in our hearts, but we blow up in irreparable ways, ruining any chance of restoration in that relationship, destroying it for good. There's this trap that the enemy wants to pull us into. The enemy wants us to think that we can just harbor a little bit of hatred, just a little bit of jealousy within our hearts, and we can just kind of keep that section separate from the rest of our being. And our lives over here will just be okay. We just have this little bit of hatred and a little bit of jealousy. But what we learned from Joseph's brothers is that when we leave those emotions and those hurts unaddressed, it eats away at our character and our integrity slowly, but eventually it will catch up to us. This morning, if there's a relationship that you have that's broken, and you're just allowing the hatred, the hurt of the past to rule and reign in your heart, I want you to know that as Christ followers, we are called to seek reconciliation. maybe you need to forgive them for how they've hurt you in the past. Maybe you need to own up for the role that you played in this situation and apologize. Or maybe it's just time to let it go and to move forward. Look, this is a whole sermon within itself. We could spend the whole morning talking about forgiveness, reconciliation, what to do. But I think I just have 3 verses for us this morning that kind of speak to what Christ is calling us to do. So take a look at these 3 verses. Colossians 3:13 says, "Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you." Jesus says here in Matthew 5:23 through 24, "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift." And then 2 Corinthians 5:18 through 19, right before the verse that we read earlier, "All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation, that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them, and he has committed to us the message of reconciliation." Why have we been called to forgive and to reconcile with those that have hurt us, that we have disagreements with, that we have broken relationships with? Because God knows what happens when we let hurt and hatred rule and reign in our hearts. It leads to destruction. But he provides a better way for us that brings healing to our lives, and that's reconciliation and forgiveness. So I implore you to seek reconciliation within those broken relationships of your life. Verses 21 through 28 says this, "When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him, Joseph, from their hands. 'Let's not take his life,' he said. 'Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wild, but don't lay a hand on him.' Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ordinate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, 'What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood.' His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt." So Reuben, as the oldest brother, he knows in his heart that killing his brother would be wrong, and tries to come up with a quick plan on his feet in order to kind of get out of this situation. But he doesn't want to risk his reputation, but he does want to save his brother. Reuben knows that if he speaks completely out against the rest of the group is thinking, then he'd be endangering himself. So he decides, I'm just going to play both sides here, okay? I'm going to help Joseph a little bit, and I'm going to, kind of give the brothers, what they want as well. He knows that while he gives this plan, he's like, if I leave him in this cistern, I'll just come back later and get Joseph out and everything will be smoothed over. Last week, we saw Judah, and Judah skirts all of his responsibilities in order to benefit himself in the short term. And this situation here is no different for Judah. He wants to get rid of his brother Joseph and make a profit off of him as well. So when the brothers see this caravan off in the distance, Judah convinces them that they might as well just sell their brother. And you know what, guys? It's actually better for Joseph this way if we don't kill him and we just sell him. It's fine. He says, he's our brother, our flesh and blood. The next couple weeks, we'll see that the journey that this one decision sends Joseph on. And see all the ways that what the brothers intended for Joseph's bad, God uses for good. But I want to slow down and I want to take a look at Reuben for a second. Remember, Reuben, he's the oldest son. And because he's the oldest within this patriarchal system, he would have been the one who's held responsible for Joseph's death. Reuben also, we learn earlier that Reuben has now fallen out of his father's graces, and he has a desire to get back to his father's approval. So what appears like a well-intended rescue mission turns out actually to just be Reuben trying to get his cake and eat it too. His motivation is not to call out the evils of his brother, stand up for Joseph, and begin reconciliation within his family, but Reuben is merely looking out for his own butt and sees an opportunity to raise his status as he saves his father's favorite son. Reuben, on the surface, is seeking to appear that he's a peacemaker without ever having the intention of helping to bring peace to the family. The cycle of dysfunction, hatred, and jealousy could have been stopped right there if Reuben truly cared about Joseph's well-being and stood up to the mob mentality of his brothers, calling out the evil for what it is. Instead, he decides he's going to kick the can down the road further, avoid the discomfort of actually calling out his brothers. Reuben is a leader seeking to elevate himself rather than care for those he's been positioned to lead. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5:9, he says this, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." This call to be peacemakers is a directive for Christians to actively pursue peace, justice, and reconciliation in a world that we often live in that's marked by conflict and evil. You see, peacemakers are not merely avoiding conflict and maintaining the status quo of this world, but instead they're actively seeking to stand up for the wrongdoings that they see. Reuben, he was in the position, he had the power to intervene and stand up to the injustice that his brother Joseph was facing, but he lacked the courage and character to do so. His intention was to help his brother avoid murder, but his lack of action caused Joseph to be sold into slavery and be taken away from his family and gone off to Egypt. Reuben's failure to stand up to his brothers is a warning sign to us of the consequences for our inaction when we do not stand up for others around us. Christ has called us to be peacemakers, which means we must be proactive in seeking peace and justice within our world. It requires us to speak out against injustice and take action to protect the vulnerable, just as Jesus did. Unlike Reuben, who hesitated and tried to manage the situation from the sidelines, we're called to be bold and unwavering to our commitment to righteousness. As Christ followers, we have to embrace being a peacemaker. We have to embrace being a peacemaker. At Westside, we use this language all the time. We have to say yes to Jesus when God calls us to do something. If you see a problem in your world, we want to be a community that is quick to go and rectify and find a solution and be the hands and feet of Christ within our community. We as Christians are called to be people of peace who are called to help towards the common good of all people. And we have heard in this story, we've heard story after story of people within our own congregation who are stepping out into that calling that God has placed on their lives. We've heard cool stories of people writing Bible study programs. We've heard of hospitals trying to be built. We've heard of people going on missions trips. But I want you to know that being a peacemaker is more than just the big stories that we tell up on stage, but it happens in our day-to-day lives as well. To be a peacemaker is to stand up for those who are on the margins of our society. To be a peacemaker is to listen to others with empathy and to truly hear their story. To be peacemakers is to willingly risk your position of power for the sake of another. To be a peacemaker is to see injustice within your world and seek to rectify it. To be a peacemaker is to get into the game and put your faith in action. You see, Reuben, he had the power, he had the position, and the status needed to step up for Joseph, yet he took the easy way out. Thankfully, our God works in mysterious ways and takes the wrongs of Joseph's brother and uses it for immense good. But the truth is, God invites us to be a part of his redeeming work here in the world and calls us to get off the sidelines and to get in the game. So embrace being a peacemaker. Our story for today ends like this in chapter 37. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It's my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on a sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. You see, Reuben, he returns to the cistern that he thought that Joseph was going to be in, only to find out that Joseph was not there anymore. The brothers had decided to do something else. The brothers then decide to take the robe of Joseph and they say, "Hey, we're going to dip it in this goat's blood and convince our father that our brother was devoured by a ferocious animal." And they take that bloody robe and they hand it to Jacob, Joseph's father, and say, "Hey, can you check and see if this is Joseph's robe?" As any father would, he looks at this robe and he says, "Yeah, this is my son Joseph's," and he's absolutely heartbroken. But he's not just heartbroken a little bit. He's heartbroken to the point where he rips his clothes, put on a sackcloth, and says, "Stay away from me. I'm just going to wait out my days until I'm dead and with my son Joseph again." For this family, they thought that was the end of Joseph. That was the end of his story. He was dead and gone, and they would never see him again. But little did they know, Joseph's story was just beginning in that moment. This morning, you may be looking at your life and being like, "It's a lost cause. I've sinned too much. I'm too far from God. I got too much baggage. There's no way that any good can come out of this situation." But I want you to know that God's not done with you yet. He's not done with you yet. We're going to close with a song called "More Like Jesus." And as we seek God and we seek to grow in our faith, our main goal is to look more like Jesus and less like ourselves. And the truth is, I think sometimes we think that spiritual growth is just knowledge and wisdom. If we just know more things, then we'll be more like Jesus. But if we're truly going to grow into the image of Jesus, then it means that our lives are going to look differently. We are going to live differently. Spiritual growth and spiritual formation is marked by actually living differently, not just by what happens up here. It means that the lives that we lived will speak louder for Jesus than just the words that we say. The hatred and jealousy that's been in our heart from our past will be stifled from the love that Christ pours out on us, and our lives will reflect that love to everyone that we come in contact with. We will embrace being peacemakers and seek to live our lives for the sake of others rather than ourselves. Sometimes I hear that I want to go deep in my faith. I want to go deeper. I want a pastor who will take me deeper so I know more. But I heard another pastor say, if we truly wanted to grow deeper, we would just start doing the simple things that we know Christ has called us to do. And we would know the love of God in a way that we don't before. We would know him better than ever. So can I implore you today? You might know the story of Joseph better. You might know more about the book of Genesis, but it does you no good if you don't put it into action. So our call to you today is to be a peacemaker, make an impact in your world. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we thank you that you invite us into your mission. You invite us into what you're doing here in this world. Give us the courage to step outside our comfort zone and to be peacemakers to those around us. We ask all this in your name we pray. Amen.